One second she was there, the next, she was gone. Barbara Bolick was just mere feet away from her hiking partner when, in just a matter of seconds, she vanished without a trace. And I don't mean that she fell out of sight or she was grabbed by someone. She truly just vanished right in front of her hiking partner. No screams, no footprints, nothing at all. That sounds impossible, right? Well, maybe it is. That's the story. Or maybe it's not impossible. I'm going to be telling you the real story of Barbara's disappearance, all of the prevailing theories, and I'm going to be telling you how this story that's been declared impossible by so many experts may not be so impossible after all. And so you're going to want to stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to hear an easily overlooked detail that changes everything. On a summer day in 2007, Barbara Bolick went on a hike with her new friend, Jim, in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. It was a friendship that would be very short-lived. Oh, and speaking of the Bitterroot Mountains, I'm actually going to be taking you on a virtual trip there right now so that you can hear the rest of this story. Now, your admission on this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button in return. And you're also going to have the added benefit of feeling all warm and fuzzy inside because you'll be helping us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers in 2025. Okay, so a few months ago, before I'd even heard of this story before, I took a very short trip to Missoula, Montana, which is just north of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a beautiful, clear day while our plane was descending into town, and I distinctly remember just kind of looking out over the Bitterroots and noticing just how vast and how empty those mountains looked. Now, because I make all of these videos, I can't help but notice when certain mountain ranges just kind of give me a strange feeling inside. Like my gut was just, I don't know. It sounds dramatic and weird, but of course, I didn't really know why at the time, but I now know that my gut feeling was for a reason, because just a few months later, here I am telling you a story about these mountains. But even putting that gut feeling aside, while my plane was landing, I also noticed just how beautiful those mountains looked. And that is something that Barbara Bolick would have agreed with wholeheartedly. I have no problem saying that because it's true. In fact, in 2001, Barbara and her husband, Carl, moved to the town of Corvallis, Montana, which is right at the base of the Bitterroots. And it didn't take long after that for Barbara to fall completely in love with those mountains. The couple had spent most of their marriage in the New York City metro area, where Carl had been stationed in the Air Force and then later worked for JP Morgan Chase. I mean, can you imagine the contrast of their lives in Montana versus their lives in New York City? I mean, going from the hustle and bustle, the skyrise buildings and the crowds, going from all that stuff to slow living, mountain cabins, and almost zero other people around you. I mean, that's incredible. Talk about two opposite worlds, right? Now, the move was initially a little bit rough for Barbara, but she quickly began to thrive in her new home. She started doing things like, taking pilot lessons. She started to ski, which is something I enjoy a lot. But actually, speaking of things I enjoy a lot, the hobby that filled Barbara with the most joy was, of course, hiking. And so with that said, I want you to take a very close look at this trail right here, because this trail, it's called Bear Creek Overlook. Well, this trail happened to be Barbara's favorite hike in the entire world. And it just so happens that the spot that you're looking at right now is the last place that Barbara was ever seen. So with that said, things are obviously about to get pretty disturbing. And so before we get into those details, I do want to lighten the mood for just a moment longer and tell you about something way more fun than the rest of this story. I mean, it's a fascinating story, very fascinating actually, but it is dark. But anyways, let me tell you about sleep. Okay, now that I say that, maybe sleep doesn't really sound that much fun, but it's definitely more fun than the rest of this story, and sleep is definitely more fun than not sleep. Am I right, guys? Am I right? So over the past year, I've actually been having some trouble sleeping. I'll feel tired and like ready to go to sleep. But then when I finally lay down, my mind just starts racing, and I usually end up thinking about this YouTube channel and how I can make the channel better. And I always end up coming back to more red arrows in the thumbnails. Okay, that's a bit of a joke, but it has been a problem for me falling asleep. Thankfully, very recently, I finally found a way to get the best possible night's sleep, and that's thanks to this video's sponsor, Beam. So before bed, I've been drinking Beam's Sleepy Time hot chocolate, which is actually called Dream. Dream has been shown to help you fall asleep, stay asleep longer, and wake up refreshed without any of that morning grogginess. You know what I'm talking about. Dream tastes absolutely amazing. My favorite flavor is cinnamon coca. It contains no added sugar, and it's only 15 calories, so you can enjoy it completely guilt-free. It's about time that you start getting the sleep that you deserve, and it just so happens that I'm gonna help you do that while saving you some money in the process. So what you're gonna do is click the link at the top of the description or scan this QR code. And when you do those things, use code KyleHatesHiking at checkout so that you can get up to 35% off Dream. It's gonna be a total game changer when it comes to your sleep. And so one more time, click that link and use code KyleHatesHiking. And now let's get back to the story. In July of 2007, the Bolicks had some visitors to their home in Montana. Now, these visitors were Carl's cousin, Donna, and Donna's boyfriend, Jim, who I'm not 100%, but I'm fairly certain had never met the Bolicks before. At least he hadn't met Barbara. Now, since the Bolicks lived in such a beautiful area, Barbara was always keen to give their visitors a glimpse into the wild Montana backcountry. I mean, who could blame her? I would do the same thing if I lived there. And so this, coupled with the fact that Barbara's husband, Carl, was no longer able to hike due to some medical issues, well, the fact that she didn't have any hiking partners ever, and the fact that she wanted to show off the beautiful area, those factors drove Barbara to invite Donna and Jim on a very short hike to the Bear Creek Overlook. And at first, Donna and Jim seemed pretty into the idea. They made plans to do the hike the very next day, and then they promptly began tossing back a few drinks, if you know what I mean. And it appears that at least one of them had at least one too many. It's possible that, I'm totally speculating here, but it is possible that if the group hadn't kind of hit the booze that night, well, I wouldn't be making this video right now. But we'll get there. So the next morning rolls around. It's now the morning of July 18th. And Donna informs Jim and Barbara that she was far too hungover to go trampling through the Montana wilderness. And, fair enough. I get it. But this did kind of put Jim and Barbara in a bit of an awkward situation. Have you ever been introduced to a new person by a friend of yours, and then, your mutual friend, the one that knows both of you, just like leaves the room, and now it's just you and this person you just met, and it's just kind of awkward, Well, I'm kind of imagining this situation with Jim and Barbara being like that when Donna decided that she didn't want to go hiking. But to be honest with you, I'm probably overthinking it because Jim and Barbara decided to go on the hike anyways. They decided to go despite Donna backing out. And thus, around 9 in the morning, Barbara said goodbye to her sleeping husband, and she told him that herself and Jim were heading to go hike Bear Creek Overlook. Now, I imagine that some of you might feel uncomfortable, even a bit scared by the prospect of a loved one going off hiking in the Montana wilderness. I mean, there's bears out there, there's all sorts of scary stuff, right? I say that, but it's actually safe to say that this was not the case with Barbara's husband, Carl. Barbara had spent years by this point hiking around in the area. In fact, she had literally done the Bear Creek Overlook Trail countless times before. It was her favorite hike. She knew the trail so well that she basically could have done it blindfolded. And in the event that something did go wrong, Barbara always carried protection. No, not that kind of protection. Get your mind out of the gutter. I'm talking about a firearm. Because this area of Montana is home to grizzly bears and mountain lions, Barbara always carried a .357 Magnum pistol when she was hiking. And so that, combined with her experience on the Bear Creek Trail, combined with the fact that she also had a hiking partner in Jim, well, all of those factors meant that the chances for something going wrong here should have been extremely low to non-existent at all. When Barbara and Jim started the 15-minute drive to the trailhead, Carl, who was still in bed, well, he wasn't worried in the slightest. But the same thing couldn't be said for Donna. Maybe it was just the hangover anxiety. I don't know what it was, but by 12 o'clock noon, well, Donna was starting to get very worried that Jim and Barbara hadn't returned yet. However, you have to keep in mind that Donna was very unfamiliar with the hiking in this area. She wasn't from there, she was just visiting, right? And Carl knew that they had been gone for a pretty normal amount of time to do this hike, and that they would likely be returning home any minute. But then, another hour passed without any sign of Jim and Barbara coming home. And it's at this point that Carl, too, began to worry. He insisted on waiting until 2 o'clock. And if the pair of hikers hadn't returned home by then, Carl would pick up the phone and he would report them missing. But, as fate would have it, Carl would never get the chance to make that call. As he was kind of debating about what to do in his head, all of a sudden Carl heard his phone ring. And he was greeted by a voice that he had never heard before. The person on the other end identified herself as a law enforcement officer for the United States Forest Service, and then she asked Carl if his wife's name was Barbara. When Carl heard that question, he braced himself. Now, I really hope that none of you have ever had to experience this, but can you just imagine a police officer calling you and then asking to confirm your spouse's name? I mean, that can only mean that some very bad news is imminent, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened to Carl. This officer informed Carl that Jim had reported his wife missing. And this came as a total shock to Carl because, once again, he was very confident that Barbara would keep herself safe while she was hiking. I mean, if anything, Carl felt that Jim should have been the hiker who became lost. I mean, he was in an unfamiliar part of the country. He had never hiked Bear Creek Overlook before. In fact, I'm not even sure if he had any hiking experience at all. The whole situation was very, very strange. And so at this point, Carl jumped into his car and he drove straight to the trailhead. And once he began to hear Jim's story, Carl's life would be changed forever. Carl and the police listened intently as Jim described a story that was basically impossible. According to Jim, himself and Barbara had made it to the actual Bear Creek Overlook, which I showed you a minute ago and you're now looking at it again. They stopped here to have a snack and they chatted with two young men who had hiked to the overlook with their dog. At some point, these two men began hiking back to the trailhead, leaving Jim and Barbara behind to enjoy the overlook. And then, sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., Jim and Barbara decided to also begin making their way back. Barbara led the way as they departed from the overlook, but Jim decided that he needed to take one final look at the beautiful view. And so while Barbara was 20 to 30 feet in front of him, Jim kind of turned around again, and he spent no more than 45 seconds taking in the view for the last time. And when he looked forward again, when he looked back down the trail, Barbara was gone. Jim hiked a little bit further down the trail, figuring that Barbara might have just kind of pulled ahead of him out of sight. But as he continued to hike further and further, he still saw no sign of her. He began meticulously searching the trail, kind of looking for any sign of what might have happened. But he found no discarded gear. He found no marks on the trail that would indicate a struggle or a fall. He found nothing out of the ordinary whatsoever. He hadn't heard anything after he turned around to look at the view. He didn't hear any screams. He didn't hear any loud or concerning sounds at all, which is very strange because the area near the overlook has a lot of loose shale. You're going to know what I'm talking about if you've ever experienced this. If you've ever tried to walk on this stuff, it's very loud and kind of clanky when you move around on it, which makes it all the weirder that Jim didn't hear anything. And so he kept hiking back towards the car. And by the time that he reached the trailhead, an unbelievable reality had kind of set in, for real. That That reality, of course, was that Barbara Bolick had just vanished into thin air. Now, the Forest Service road that Jim and Barbara had parked on was under construction at the time. And so when Jim emerged from the woods, there were actually a few construction workers nearby. Jim began talking with these construction workers, and of course, he asked them the obvious question, had they seen Barbara? And the answer to that was no, they hadn't seen her. But they had seen those two young men with their dog. Since these two men were the only other possible witnesses besides Jim, the police immediately began working to track them down. And this would end up being much more challenging than it sounds. Pretty soon after, a massive search for Barbara was launched. And usually when a hiker goes missing, even if like the hiker themselves aren't located, there's usually like some sort of evidence that's found. You know, maybe a piece of their gear or some prints in the dirt, or at the very least, their scent is tracked by dogs, which gives some initial clues into, you know, what direction they traveled. What makes Barbara's disappearance so baffling, and I do not use that word lightly, is that despite a professional and very thorough search, none of the things I just mentioned were found. Literally nothing. No tracks, no scent, no discarded gear, nothing. Literally nothing. Which meant that the only thing the police had to go off was Jim's version of events and the version of events from those young men, if they could ever find them. So how could someone just vanish right in front of their hiking partner? I mean, there has to be some sort of explanation, right? And the answer to that question is, well, there's actually a few explanations. And so you better listen closely, because it's actually going to be up to you to decide which one of these makes the most sense. Weeks, months, and eventually years went by, and to this day, no sign of Barbara has ever been found. And to make this case even stranger, no sign of those two men that were on the trail that day has ever been found either. They never came forward, their identities remain unknown, and that's all despite a fairly large media campaign to try and find them. That's all despite a composite sketch, and it's despite a $10,000 reward for identifying them. Somehow they just never found these men. And that actually brings us into our first, and definitely not our last, theory about what happened to Barbara Bolick. Now, I need to stress here that pretty much everything that you're going to hear for the rest of this video is going to be speculation. I'll make it clear when I'm telling you a cold hard fact, but a lot of this is just going to be kind of exploring the possibilities of what might have happened. So the first theory is that those two unidentified young men had something to do with Barbara's disappearance. And I will admit that it is a bit suspicious that they were the only other hikers on the trail at the time, and that they never came forward and identified themselves. Like, what did they have to hide? The nearby town of Missoula does have a university there, University of Montana, I believe. And so it's possible that maybe these two young guys were like college aged and they went to school there, but I don't really know. It certainly seems weird that the only two other witnesses disappeared, but at the same time, it is very possible that these two men just simply never found out about Barbara's disappearance. I mean, they could still be out there to this day, you know, just blissfully unaware of the baffling mystery that they unknowingly took part in. I mean, hell, they could even be watching this video right now. So if that's you, hey, you might want to call somebody. Nah, but in all seriousness, it's very likely that these two men just never found out about the case. I mean, maybe they were visiting at the time and, you know, they got back from their hike in the Montana mountains and then they flew back to Cleveland or wherever they're from, and the news just never spread to them. And in addition to that, there's actually another thing that kind of contradicts this theory, and it actually contradicts the next theory as well. And so let me tell you about that first. Another common theory that explains Barbara's disappearance, and I guarantee a few of you have already been thinking this, maybe you've even commented it by this point. This theory is that Barbara could have been attacked by an animal, maybe a mountain lion or a bear or something like that. And while this certainly is possible, I tend to think it's pretty unlikely, because once again, there were no signs of a struggle found anywhere on the trail. Like, there was no drag marks or blood or even any marks in the dirt at all. And once again, Jim heard no noise. He heard no screaming. Barbara was so close in proximity to Jim when she disappeared. Like, I don't know. I feel like if she was attacked by an animal or even by a person for that matter, going back to the previous theory, I just feel like there would have been any sign of it, right? The searchers didn't find anything. And don't forget, once again, she was carrying that .357 Magnum, which she certainly would have used if she needed to defend herself. It's for all of those reasons that I think an animal or a human attack on the trail is pretty unlikely. If you have any evidence to the contrary, I'd love to hear it in the comments section, genuinely. And so that brings us to our next set of theories, which is that Barbara either took her own life or that she intentionally disappeared, ran off, and then started a new life somewhere. Now, the new life theory seems pretty much impossible to me. I don't know how she would have pulled that off. And as far as I'm aware, she didn't have a motive to do this, or a motive to take her own life for that matter. Her marriage was stable. She liked her life in Montana. She even loved it, you could say. In addition to all that, she was also looking forward to some future travel plans that she had discussed with her friends and her family. And so, based on all that, I think those two scenarios are pretty unlikely. Now, one of the most perplexing aspects of this case is that search dogs were brought in just a few hours after Barbara disappeared, to try to track her, to lock onto her scent and give some indication of where she went. And yet, despite being brought in so quickly, the dogs never identified her scent. And let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't mean that the dogs just couldn't track her scent, or that they followed her scent for a while and then eventually they lost it. I mean that the dogs literally never picked up a scent anywhere, including at that overlook that Barbara had taken a lunch break at. I mean, how is that possible? She was on the mountain just hours earlier, and yet her scent is nowhere to be found. It almost seems like it's not possible, right? And so this, folks, is where the biggest twist in this entire case comes in. This is the twist that's going to make you question pretty much everything I've told you about this story so far. There's only one logical theory that explains why Barbara vanished into thin air, one theory that explains why her scent was never found on the trail, and why there was no sounds or signs of a struggle. What if Barbara was never actually on the mountain that day at all? What if she never hiked the Bear Creek Trail on July 18th, 2007? I could be wrong, but in my opinion, this is the only possible explanation for her disappearance. And that, of course, begs a few questions like, where is she then? And who took her? Now, the obvious person to point the finger at here is Jim, of course. I mean, he was the last person to be seen with Barbara. And so is it possible that he killed her and then staged the hike so that police would be thrown off? Or is it even possible that Carl and Donna were involved as well, and they all colluded in order to kill Barbara, and that explains why she was never actually on the mountain? Those are very reasonable theories, and they've been discussed by people online quite a bit. I'm sure they'll be discussed in the comments of this video. Respectfully, please. Maybe those theories are possible. But to be honest with you, that stuff also seems hard to believe, in my opinion. The police obviously investigated Jim, Carl, and Donna, and you might be shocked to hear that all of them were cleared of involvement. None of them have ever been charged, and to be honest with you, it doesn't even really seem like they were ever considered suspects. Jim even volunteered to take a polygraph test, though the police didn't take him up on this for some reason. I find that a little strange. There's been no motives uncovered by any of the three of them, for why they would want to kill Barbara. There's never been any hard evidence found that points the finger at them, and all of them fully cooperated with the police. Folks, this is a mystery in the truest sense. And to be honest, out of all of the stories I've told on this channel, out of all the hikers that have gone missing that I've talked about, this one is by far the biggest head scratcher. To me, it seems impossible that Barbara actually made it onto the mountain that day. I mean, Jim's story just seems impossible and can't be true. And yet, it also seems impossible that Jim could have killed Barbara and then covered it up so easily in an unfamiliar environment, leaving the police with zero evidence to this day. Like, that doesn't really make sense either. I genuinely hope I'm wrong about this, but I think that this is one of those cases that will probably go unsolved forever, which is tragic. My heart goes out to Barbara Bolick. And guys, please leave some love for her in the comments section below. I just really appreciate it when you guys do that. YouTube seems to think that you'd enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click, and I will see all of you in the next video. Guys, thank you so much for just being the best subscribers on YouTube. I'm so blessed. Have a good one.